He thought she was just a waitress, but before the night was over, Damien Moretti would learn that some women did not bend, not for money, not for power, and certainly not for men like him. The first thing Zariah Bennett noticed that Friday night was the cold. Not outside, where October wind slipped between the towers of lower Manhattan and chased people into town cars and marble lobbies, but inside Moretti House, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, where the air was polished, expensive, and just a little cruel. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath amber light. Jazz floated low through the dining room. Men in tailored suits leaned back like they owned the world, and women in silk dresses smiled with the confidence of people who had never once checked a grocery bill before putting food in a cart. Zariah moved through it all with a silver tray balanced on one hand and dignity balanced on the other. She had learned that trick years ago. At 27, she knew how to carry herself when the room wanted her smaller. She knew how to keep her voice calm when customers snapped their fingers. She knew how to hear condescension and answer with grace sharp enough to leave a mark. What she did not know, not yet, was that a pair of blue eyes had already found her from the back corner of the room. Damien Moretti sat in the private dining alcove like a man carved out of control itself, his black suit immaculate, his posture effortless, one hand resting near a crystal tumbler untouched for the last 10 minutes. At 6'3", with broad shoulders and a face too composed to be called handsome in any ordinary way, he did not need to raise his voice to command a room. The room adjusted itself around him. Conversation softened when he stood. Waiters straightened when he glanced up. Even laughter seemed to stop at the edge of his table, as if afraid to cross into his orbit without permission. He had built his life on rules, on order, on the kind of discipline that made weaker men call him ruthless and stronger men call him inevitable. But tonight, the only thing disrupting that order was a waitress in black slacks and a fitted white shirt, her curls pinned back, her chin lifted, and her expression far too steady for a woman working a Friday rush in his restaurant. Zariah reached table 12 with a bottle of Cabernet and the patient smile she saved for difficult people. For finance guys in loosened ties and loud confidence barely looked at her face. She poured with practiced precision, ignoring the careless jokes, the dismissive tone, the assumption that because she was serving them, she must be beneath them. Then one of them let his hand drift where it had no business being. The smile vanished from her face. In one smooth motion, Zariah caught his wrist, set his hand firmly back on the tablecloth, and looked him dead in the eye. "Keep your hands to yourself," she said, quiet enough that he had to lean in, steady enough that the whole table went still. The man blinked, embarrassed more by her lack of fear than by being corrected. His friends laughed the way cowards laugh when they do not know which side power is on yet. Zariah did not flinch. She straightened, adjusted the bottle in her hand, and held that silence like she owned it. Across the room, Damien Moretti finally reached for his glass, but he never took a sip. For the first time all evening, something had caught him off guard. The laughter at table 12 faded in pieces, awkward and thin, like men trying to pretend they had not just witnessed something they did not understand. Zariah Bennett finished pouring the Cabernet without a tremor in her hand, then set the bottle down with the kind of care that made the silence sharper, not softer. The man who had tested her gave a quick smile meant to pass everything off as a joke, but it landed badly. His friends looked anywhere but at her. In rooms like this, embarrassment always moved faster than apology. "Anything else for the table?" she asked. Her voice was smooth, professional, almost gentle, and somehow that made it worse for them. One of the others muttered no thank you. Zariah inclined her head and stepped away before her pulse could betray her. She knew better than to look toward the private alcove at the back of the room, but she felt it anyway, the weight of attention, cold and precise as winter sunlight on glass. Damien Moretti was still watching. She could feel that much in her bones. By the time she reached the service station near the kitchen, her coworker Lena grabbed her forearm. "Are you out of your mind?" Lena whispered, eyes wide over a stack of dessert plates. "That was table 12. They spend more in one night than I make in 2 months." Zariah reached for the order pad, pretending her hands were steadier than they felt. "Then maybe they can afford manners." Lena stared at her for half a second, caught between horror and admiration. "You cannot talk like that in here." "I did not," Zariah said. "I simply declined to be treated like furniture." But the truth was, her heartbeat had not settled. Moretti House paid better than any restaurant she had worked in, and she needed every dollar of it. Rent on the two-bedroom apartment in Crown Heights was due in 9 days. Her mother's physical therapy bill was folded inside her purse, unopened only because she already knew what it said. Her younger brother Malik had been pretending not to worry about college application fees, but she saw the tension in his jaw every time he thought no one was looking. People like to imagine courage as something clean and glamorous. In reality, it usually showed up wearing non-slip shoes and calculating whether dignity was worth losing an hourly wage. Zariah tucked a loose curl behind her ear and returned to the floor with a tray of sparkling water. She had been doing some version of this since she was 16, first at a diner in Newark where truckers left decent tips and bad comments in equal measure, then in chain restaurants, then in upscale places where the insults wore cuff links and smelled like expensive cologne. She had learned that wealth changed the wrapping, not always the character. Men with power often expected the same thing from women like her: quiet, gratitude, compliance. Smile, absorb, move on. But Zariah had been raised by a woman who cleaned offices at night and still found the strength to say, every single morning, you do not have to be rude to protect your self-respect, but you do have to protect it. Her mother had said it over oatmeal, over bus schedules, over second-hand textbooks spread across the kitchen table. She had said it after landlords talked down to them, and after guidance counselors suggested community college with voices that meant lower your expectations. Zariah had listened. She had also remembered. Near the back of the room, Damien shifted slightly in his chair. It was not much, just a measured movement of his shoulders as one of his associates leaned in to speak, but the entire table responded to it. A pause, a nod, the kind of silent choreography that only happened around men used to being obeyed. He looked older up close than tabloid photos suggested, maybe 36, not because of lines on his face, but because of the stillness in him. He did not fidget. He did not waste motion. Even his attention felt expensive, like something dangerous people competed to earn and prayed not to lose. Zariah had seen his name in newspapers and business magazines, always framed in polished language. Investor, restaurateur, real estate force, private, strategic, untouchable. The city liked to clean up men like Damien Moretti with elegant vocabulary, but everyone in Manhattan knew there were some people whose influence moved too quietly to be measured on paper. She had never served him directly before tonight. Usually his personal staff handled that. Usually women like her stayed background, useful and unseen. Yet every time she passed the reflection of the private alcove in the mirrored wine wall, she caught the same impossible thing. He was not looking at the room. He was looking at her. The realization sat strangely under her ribs. It was not vanity. It was warning. Men like Damien Moretti did not notice ordinary details unless those details had become relevant. And somehow, against her own better judgment, Zariah Bennett had just become relevant. The dinner rush rolled forward as if nothing had happened, but inside Moretti House, nothing moved quite the same after a room had seen a woman refuse humiliation without raising her voice. Zariah Bennett felt it in the altered rhythm of every table she approached. Men who had barely looked at her before now glanced up twice. Women who usually treated waitstaff like part of the wallpaper watched her with curiosity sharpened by something less kind. The air had changed. Not loudly, not visibly, but in places built on status. The smallest act of defiance traveled like perfume through silk. By 9:30, the restaurant glowed at full power. Candles burned lower in their crystal cups. Plates arrived beneath silver domes and disappeared again in the hands of silent servers trained to move like shadows. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan flickered in wet reflections, taxi lights stretching across the avenue in long ribbons of gold and red. Inside, everything was polished, expensive, and controlled. That was Damien Moretti's preference. Control in the lighting. Control in the service. Control in the temperature of the red wine and the spacing between tables and the exact way a chair should be pulled for a woman in couture. He had built the restaurant the same way he built every other piece of his empire, by making sure nothing happened without his knowledge and very little happened without his approval. It was why the moment stayed with him. Not the customer's hand, not the awkward laughter that followed, but the look on Zariah Bennett's face after. No panic, no pleading. No quick glance around the room to see who might rescue her. She had corrected the situation as if she were not asking permission from anyone, including him. Damien sat back in the private alcove while his attorney discussed a zoning issue downtown, but the words slid past him unheard. He had spent most of his adult life reading people before they spoke. It had kept him ahead of competitors, ahead of opportunists, ahead of polished liars in Italian suits and elected officials with handshake smiles. He knew fear in all its versions. He knew greed before it reached the eyes. He knew ambition dressed up as loyalty. But that woman on his floor had looked at disrespect the way some people looked at rain. Inconvenient, unwelcome, but not enough to change her course. Damien. The voice brought him back. Vincent Russo, his chief of operations, was watching him over a glass of sparkling water, one dark brow slightly raised. You were somewhere else. Damien picked up his tumbler, rolling the amber liquid once before setting it down again. Am I? Vincent followed the line of his sight without moving his head. He was careful that way. Table 12 was out of line. I noticed. Most servers would have smiled and let management smooth it over. Damien's gaze drifted to the service station, where Zariah was speaking quietly to the hostess, her posture straight, her expression composed. She is not most servers. Vincent gave a faint smile that stopped short of amusement. No, she is not. That should have been the end of it. A brief observation. A passing disruption. The kind of moment powerful men forgot before dessert. But Damien did not forget. Because the longer he watched, the stranger it became. Zariah was not performing confidence for attention. She was not angling for sympathy or trying to turn one incident into leverage. She simply continued working. She checked on a couple near the window with genuine patience. She knelt beside an elderly woman's chair just long enough to hear a request without making the woman repeat herself. She replaced a fork for a boy in a navy blazer who had dropped his first one and done it with such calm kindness that the child stopped looking embarrassed. There was no theater in her. No visible need to prove anything. And somehow that drew Damien more than beauty ever had. Beauty he understood. Beauty was common currency in his world. He had known women with perfect faces, educated voices, and social polish sharp enough to cut a weaker man in half. They arrived at galas draped in diamonds and strategic smiles. They understood his name before they understood him, and most never cared to know the difference. Zariah Bennett, by contrast, looked like she would rather miss a shift than flatter the wrong person. That should have irritated him. Instead, it unsettled something in him he had spent years burying under routine and power and distance. At 10:05, the head manager, Julian Mercer, approached the alcove with the cautious expression of a man who knew exactly how expensive a mistake could become. Julian was in his 40s, trim, discreet, and usually unshakable. Tonight there was a slight tightness around his mouth. Sir, he said softly, a word? Damien stood without answering and followed him toward the corridor near the wine cellar, away from the dining room and its velvet noise. The hallway smelled faintly of citrus polish and old oak. Julian lowered his voice. There has been a complaint from table 12. Damien's face did not change. About. Julian hesitated for half a second. Miss Bennett's tone. They are requesting an apology. They also implied they may not return. For a moment, the only sound was the muted clink of glassware from the bar. Damien looked past Julian through the narrow opening to the dining room, and there she was again, balancing a tray on one hand, moving through candlelight with that same impossible calm. The complaint did not surprise him. Men like that always wanted punishment when they failed to get obedience. What surprised him was the reaction that rose in him, cold and immediate, at the thought of anyone in his restaurant asking that woman to bow her head for keeping her self-respect. Where is she now? He asked. Julian blinked. She is finishing table 6, sir. Damien adjusted the cuff of his black jacket, his voice quiet enough to make Julian straighten. Send her to my office when her section is clear. Julian's eyes flickered with relief and uncertainty at once. Yes, sir. Damien turned back toward the private corridor leading upstairs, every step measured, every thought sharper than the last. He had no habit of summoning staff over a single complaint. He had even less interest in explaining himself. But 5 minutes from now, Zariah Bennett would walk into his office believing the night had finally come due. And Damien Moretti, who prided himself on always knowing the next move before anyone else made it, was no longer entirely sure what his own would be. The message reached Zariah Bennett at 10:12, delivered in the careful voice staff used when trouble wore expensive shoes. Mr. Moretti wants to see you in his office. For 1 second, everything inside her went still. Then the room returned all at once, the hum of conversation, the soft scrape of cutlery on china, the distant hiss. From the espresso machine near the bar, Lena, carrying a tray of panna cotta, stopped beside her and whispered, "That cannot be good." Zariah adjusted the cuff of her white shirt, forcing her fingers not to fidget. "No," she said quietly. "Probably not." She finished dropping the check at table 6, thanked a couple for dining with them, and handed off her final table to the late shift server with a calm she did not feel. There was a certain kind of fear that made people noisy. Zariah had never been that kind. Her fear turned inward, precise and private, like a needle stitching worst-case scenarios together in the dark. By the time she stepped into the private corridor behind the wine wall, she had already imagined losing the job, losing next month's rent, losing the fragile sense of stability she had built one double shift at a time. The hallway upstairs was quieter than the restaurant below, carpeted in deep charcoal, lit by brass sconces that threw soft gold across cream walls lined with framed black and white photographs of old New York. Money had a smell in places like this: cedarwood, polish, and the faint absence of haste. At the end of the corridor, a door stood open. Julian Mercer waited beside it, his usual smooth composure replaced by something more neutral, more careful. "He is inside," Julian said. "You can go in." Zariah nodded once and stepped across the threshold. The office was larger than her apartment living room, all dark oak, soft leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Rain had started sometime in the last half hour, and Manhattan below looked blurred at the edges, streetlights melting into the wet glass like gold paint dragged by hand. A low lamp glowed beside a shelf of first editions. An antique decanter caught the light on a sideboard. Nothing in the room was loud, but everything in it was costly. Damien Moretti stood near the windows with one hand in his pocket, his jacket still on, his tie loosened by less than an inch. He turned when she entered, and the room seemed to tighten around the movement. Up close, he was even more controlled than he had appeared from across the dining room. Not colder exactly, but more deliberate. Men like him did not waste expressions. They selected them. "Close the door," he said. His voice was low, even impossible to read. Zariah did as instructed and remained standing. "You wanted to see me, sir." Damien regarded her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Not in the way some men looked at women when they wanted an advantage, or a reaction, or a weakness to press. This was different. Assessing. Precise. As if he were trying to place her in a category and finding none that fit. "Do you know why you are here?" he asked. Zariah met his eyes because looking down felt too much like surrender. "I assumed table 12 complained." Something almost imperceptible shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly. Recognition, perhaps, that she would not waste time pretending. "They did." "Then I assume you were going to tell me I should have smiled and let management handle it." Her voice stayed respectful, but only just. Damien's gaze sharpened. "Is that what you think I brought you up here to say?" She hesitated. Honesty had already cost her once tonight. It seemed pointless to become timid now. "I think men with money do not like being corrected in public," she said. "And I think businesses that depend on men with money usually decide women like me are easier to replace than customers like them." The words landed between them without decoration. No tears. No bitterness. Just fact. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Damien took 2 measured steps toward his desk and rested his fingertips against its edge. "Women like you," he repeated. "What does that mean?" Zariah almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in the room. "It means the kind who are expected to be grateful just to be here." Her chin lifted a fraction. "The kind who are told professionalism means swallowing disrespect in heels and calling it hospitality." Silence followed. Not empty silence. Heavy silence. The kind that gathered around things rarely spoken aloud in expensive rooms. Damien did not interrupt her. That unsettled her more than anger would have. Most powerful men rush to remind you of their version before yours had finished taking shape. He only watched. "Did he touch you?" he asked at last. The directness of the question caught her off guard. "Yes." "And you told him not to do it again?" "Yes." "Did you insult him?" Zariah blinked. "No." "Did you raise your voice?" "No." Damien looked at her for another long moment, then moved behind the desk and tapped a button on the panel built discreetly near the lamp. A screen lit up on the far wall. Security footage. Zoraya's stomach dropped. The camera angle showed table 12 in clean, silent clarity. Her own figure moved into frame, poised, efficient, pouring wine. The man's hand. Her response. Firm, fast, controlled. No dramatics. No scene. Just one woman drawing a line and holding it. Damien stopped the playback after 7 seconds. The office returned to quiet. Zoraya stood very still, unsure whether the footage had saved her or ended her. Damien reached for the remote, set it down, and finally said the one thing she had not prepared herself to hear. You handled it better than my manager would have. She stared at him, convinced for half a second that she had misheard. Excuse me. You heard me. He came around the desk now, slower this time, not crowding her, but near enough that the force of his attention felt almost physical. Table 12 is no longer welcome in my restaurant. The room went silent in a different way then. Zoraya felt it in her chest before she trusted it with her mind. You are banning them? I am, Damien said. I do not reward men for mistaking my staff for objects they can test. She searched his face for irony, for calculation, for the catch that usually followed unexpected kindness in rooms ruled by men. She found none. Only that same unnerving steadiness. Then why am I here? She asked softly. Damien's gaze held hers without wavering. Because I wanted to know why you were not afraid of me. Zoraya Bennett did not answer right away. She left Damien Moretti's office with the invitation sitting in her chest like a stone dropped into deep water, the ripples moving long after the surface looked calm. By the time she changed out of her uniform in the staff room downstairs, Manhattan was still wet with rain, and the city outside looked blurred and uncertain, as if even the skyline had not decided what shape the night was supposed to take. She took the subway home to Crown Heights because that was what people like her did, no matter what powerful men offered in oak-paneled offices above candlelit dining rooms. She stood beneath the hard white lights of the station with her purse tucked close and her shoulders squared against the draft coming off the tracks, replaying every word Damien had said and mistrusting all of them equally. When she reached the apartment, Malik was at the kitchen table with college brochures spread in front of him and a bowl of cereal gone soft in milk. Her mother was asleep in the next room, the television casting low blue light across the hallway. Home smelled like detergent, peppermint tea, and the steady effort of people trying to make too little feel like enough. You are late, Malik said, glancing up. Busy night. Zoraya slipped off her shoes and set her keys in the chipped ceramic bowl by the sink. Something like that. He studied her face for a second, too perceptive for 19, too used to watching her carry more than she admitted. That means yes. She almost smiled, but the night had not loosened its grip on her yet. It means I got invited somewhere strange. Malik leaned back in his chair. By who? Zoraya poured herself a glass of water before answering, because saying the name out loud made the whole thing feel even less believable. My boss. The scary rich one. That narrows it down very little in Manhattan. The one who owns the restaurant. She nodded. Malik let out a low whistle, then lowered his voice instinctively, though their mother was asleep behind a closed door. Why would a man like that invite you anywhere? Zoraya stared down at the water in her glass. That is exactly the question. She did not tell him everything. Not the complaint. Not the office. Not the way Damien had asked why she was not afraid of him, as if the answer mattered. But she told him enough. Enough for Malik to frown in the thoughtful way he had inherited from their mother. Enough for him to say, do not go anywhere that makes you feel small. Zoraya looked at him then, really. Looked at the young man trying so hard to sound grown while college catalogs spilled across the table beside a cracked sugar jar and a stack of unpaid bills. That was the problem. Rooms like Damien Moretti's had been designed for people like her to feel small before they even opened their mouths. The next day dragged and flew at the same time. By 4 in the afternoon, she had said yes. She still did not know whether the decision came from courage, curiosity, or simple refusal to let another world define what she was allowed to walk into. At 6:30, a car pulled up outside her building, black, quiet, and far too elegant for her block. The driver handed her a garment bag and said only, Mr. Moretti asked that you have enough time. Inside the bag was a dress so understated it almost hurt. No sequins, no glitter, just deep midnight blue, soft fabric, long lines, and the kind of tailoring that did not ask for attention because it expected it. There were shoes too, low enough to be practical, expensive enough to make her nervous. Tucked into the inner pocket was a card in thick cream stock. Wear what makes you feel like yourself. The handwriting was clean, controlled, unmistakably his. Soraya stood in her bedroom for a long time with the dress hanging from one hand and the card in the other. She had expected something performative, something chosen to transform her into a version of femininity rich men found convenient. Instead, the dress looked like an argument for restraint. It looked like respect, which only made the whole situation more dangerous. By 8:05, she was in the back seat of the town car crossing into the Upper East Side, watching the city change outside the window, storefronts softer, sidewalks cleaner, buildings older and more certain of their own importance. Damien's townhouse stood on a tree-lined block behind black iron gates and warm stone, all symmetry and silence. The doorman opened her door before she reached for the handle. Inside, the entry hall gleamed under a chandelier that gave off honey-colored light. Marble floors stretched beneath a runner, so thick her footsteps barely made a sound. Somewhere deeper in the house, voices rose and settled like the clink of fragile things. A woman in a charcoal dress approached with practiced grace. "Miss Bennett," she said. "This way, please." Soraya followed her through rooms that looked curated rather than lived in, walls lined with art, fireplaces framed in carved stone, arrangements of white orchids so perfect they seemed almost unreal. She could feel the eyes before she reached the drawing room. People in expensive evening wear had a way of turning attention into temperature. The room cooled as she entered. Conversation softened. A woman in emerald silk let her gaze travel from Soraya's shoes to her face and back again with a smile too polished to be kind. A silver-haired man paused mid-sentence. Another woman lifted her champagne flute without drinking, studying her over the rim. They had already decided what she was before she spoke. Staff. Mistake. Entertainment. Damien stood near the fireplace in a black suit that made the room look decorative by comparison. When he saw her, something in his posture shifted, just enough for her to notice, just enough for the room to notice too. He crossed to her through the silence with calm, measured steps, and when he stopped in front of her his gaze moved once over the dress, not possessive, not appraising, simply taking in the fact that she had come. "You made it," he said. Soraya held his eyes. "I almost did not." One corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough to unsettle her. "I know." Then he turned to the room, offered her his arm, and said in a voice low enough for only her to hear, "You should know something before we begin." Soraya did not take his arm yet. "What?" His blue eyes held steady on hers while the room watched. "Every person in here is about to underestimate you." Soraya took Damien Moretti's arm only after deciding that refusing him in front of that room would give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. His sleeve was smooth beneath her fingers, the fabric cool and precise, but it was the stillness in him that she noticed most. He did not guide her like a man showing off a prize. He walked beside her like someone fully aware that every eye in the room had turned and that none of those eyes were looking at her kindly. "Then let them," she said under her breath. Damien glanced down at her, and for a moment something unreadable moved behind his expression, something close to approval, but quieter than that. "That," he murmured, "is exactly why you are here." The drawing room was all soft lamplight, pale stone, and old money dressed in modern tailoring. A string quartet played in the next room, low enough to sound like memory. Silver trays moved through the space in the hands of staff, trained not to exist. At the center of it all stood men who ran hedge funds and private equity firms, women whose names appeared on museum boards, and a few faces Soraya recognized from the kind of magazine covers she only saw while waiting in pharmacy lines. Every smile in the room looked expensive. Not many looked sincere. Damien introduced her with almost no flourish, which somehow carried more force than performance would have. "This is Miss Soraya Bennett," he said to a cluster near the fireplace. "She is my guest. Not from the restaurant. Not one of the staff. Not explained away in language designed to make everyone comfortable. His guest." The words landed exactly the way he intended. One man in a navy tuxedo covered his surprise by reaching for his drink. A woman with diamonds at her throat offered a smile thin enough to slice paper. "How lovely," she said. in the tone people used when they meant the opposite. And where did you two meet? Soraya saw the question for what it was. Not curiosity. Sorting. Classification. The room wanted a neat answer that would allow it to place her safely beneath itself. Before Damien could speak, she answered. At his restaurant, she said evenly. I work there. The woman's brows lifted just slightly, a tiny movement that carried a lifetime of training. How refreshing, she said. Most people prefer to keep their professional worlds separate from their social ones. Soraya smiled, not brightly, not apologetically, just enough to let the woman know the remark had arrived and would not be allowed to settle comfortably. Maybe that is because most people are afraid of being seen outside the roles they assign themselves. For a beat, no one spoke. The woman's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. Beside her, Damien remained perfectly still, but Soraya felt the shift in him all the same. He had expected resistance from the room. He had not expected her to answer it with elegance sharp enough to leave no bruise, only silence. A silver-haired man recovered first, letting out a polite laugh meant to patch over the moment. You are quick, he said. You would have to be, Soraya replied, if people kept confusing politeness for permission to be condescending. This time the silence spread farther. It moved across nearby conversations, across the polished little circles of wealth and certainty, until even people who had not heard the first exchange understood something interesting had happened. Damien turned his head slightly toward her. Walk with me, he said. It sounded casual. It was not. He guided her toward the library just off the main room, where shelves climbed to the ceiling and the scent of leather bindings softened the air. Through the open doorway, she could still hear the party breathing, but in here the light was warmer, the pressure less public. Damien faced her fully for the first time since she had arrived. You could have let that go, he said. Soraya lifted one shoulder. I could have, but then she would have assumed she was clever. To her surprise, he laughed then, quiet and brief, but real. It changed his face more than any smile should have, taking some of the marble out of him, replacing it with something human and unexpectedly young. Do you know what everyone in that room thinks right now? He asked. Probably that you have lost your mind. No, he said, blue eyes steady on hers. They think I brought in someone unpredictable. Soraya held his gaze. Did you? His expression settled again, but not all the way back to cold. No, I think I brought in someone honest, and that is far more inconvenient. Before she could answer, a woman's voice drifted in from the doorway. Damien, there you are. Soraya turned. The woman standing there wore ivory silk and old confidence, the kind built over years of being admired in every room. She entered. She was beautiful in a polished, deliberate way, with dark blonde hair swept back from a face that had never once had to wonder if it belonged. Her gaze landed on Soraya and stayed there half a second too long. I was wondering who had the entire room whispering, she said. Damien's jaw tightened by a degree so small most people would not have seen it. Soraya, this is Celeste Armand. Something in the air altered again. Not dramatically, just enough. Soraya understood at once that Celeste was not just another guest. She was history, the kind of history that expected to remain relevant. Celeste smiled, but there was no warmth in it. So you are the surprise, she said. Soraya returned the look without lowering her eyes. I did not realize I was one. Celeste stepped into the room, the silk of her gown whispering over the rug. Oh, you are, she said softly. The question is whether you know what kind. And in that instant, Soraya saw it clearly. The challenge Damien had invited her into was not the room, not the whispers, not even the wealth. It was the people who smiled while trying to remind you that no matter how well you carried yourself, they had already decided where you belonged. Celeste Armand had the kind of smile that had probably ended arguments before they began for most of her adult life. It was elegant, polished, and almost kind, which made it more dangerous than open contempt ever could have been. Soraya Bennett recognized that kind of woman immediately, not because they came from the same world, but because women like Celeste had always known exactly how to make exclusion sound graceful. The library seemed smaller with her in it, the warm light turning sharper at the edges. Damien Moretti did not move closer to either woman. He simply stood there, one hand resting loosely at his side, his expression unreadable in the way only men with too much power could afford. Celeste, he said, his voice smooth enough to pass for calm. You remember how to enter a room without announcing yourself. I assume this is selective amnesia. Celeste let out a soft laugh, as though they were sharing a private joke from a more comfortable time. I would say the same to you, but clearly you have chosen surprise over discretion tonight. Her eyes returned to Zariah. You must forgive me. Damien does not usually enjoy shocking his guests unless he has a reason. Zariah could have said many things. She could have smiled politely and swallowed the sting the way women in service jobs were trained to do. She could have played humble and let the woman keep the upper hand. Instead, she tilted her head very slightly and said, "That makes two of us. I do not usually enjoy being discussed like a centerpiece either." The words were gentle. The impact was not. Celeste's smile paused, just for a second, and in that second Damien saw what the rest of the room would have missed. Zariah was not trying to win. She was protecting something more valuable than approval. Self-respect. It was the same thing that had caught his attention the night before, and seeing it here, in a room designed to make women like Celeste comfortable and women like Zariah careful, sharpened something in him he had not expected. Celeste recovered quickly. Women like her always did. You are direct, she said. It is refreshing in small doses. And honesty is easier to appreciate, Zariah replied, when no one has spent years mistaking politeness for weakness. This time, the silence in the library rippled outward. Through the open doorway, two guests near the drinks table had gone visibly still. One older man pretended to examine the spines of books on the far shelf while listening far too closely. The room was no longer observing casually. It was waiting. Damien had seen rooms wait before. He had built careers and ended negotiations in pauses exactly like this one. But this was different. This was not business. It was hierarchy. It was a woman from the right world deciding whether to cut down a woman from the wrong one, and a powerful man standing between the old rules and whatever came next. Celeste stepped farther into the library, the hem of her ivory silk dress whispering against the rug. Perhaps, she said softly, but there are still rules. Social ones. Practical ones. Rooms like this can be unforgiving to people who do not understand them. Zariah knew a warning when she heard one. More than that, she knew a threat that had been dressed for dinner. Her heartbeat quickened, but her face gave nothing away. I understand more than you think. Celeste gave her a look almost tender in its pity. I am sure you do, but understanding a room is not the same as surviving it. Damien's gaze snapped to Celeste then, blue and cold, and suddenly unmistakable. That is enough. The words were quiet. The effect was not. Celeste turned toward him, surprise flashing over her face before pride covered it again. I was only trying to be helpful. No, Damien said, every syllable precise. You were trying to remind my guest that you believe she does not belong here. The library went still, then the room beyond it seemed to still in response, as if everyone had heard the shape of what was happening, even if not every word. Celeste's face did not crumble. Women like her were too practiced for that. But something brittle entered her expression, a fine line under the surface. Your guest, she repeated. Is that what this is? Damien did not look away. That is exactly what this is. For one suspended second, no one moved. Zariah felt the moment pass through the room like a cold wind under a door. The old rules had just been interrupted, not politely, not privately, but in full view of the people who benefited most from them. Celeste's chin lifted. Interesting, she said. Because half the people in this house are already whispering, and the other half are calling this a lapse in judgment. Then they are welcome to leave, Damien replied. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The library seemed to lose oxygen. Across the room, one of the men near the drinks table lowered his glass without sipping. The older woman in emerald silk glanced toward the doorway, visibly calculating how much she had just witnessed and who she could tell first. Damien rarely repeated himself, and everyone in that room knew it. Celeste looked at him as if seeing a new man where the old one had stood only a moment before. Then she turned to Zariah, and for the first time the polished smile was gone. You should be careful, she said quietly. Men like him can make unusual choices when they are bored, but women like you are the ones expected to survive the consequences. The words were cool, almost intimate, and that made them sharper. Zariah felt them land because part of her feared they might be true. Not about Damien's intentions, but about the world around him. A world where a single invitation could become a label. A glance could become gossip. A room full of rich strangers could decide your character before midnight and repeat their decision in more powerful rooms by morning. She met Celeste's eyes without blinking. Then maybe the problem is not women like me. Damien's head turned slightly toward her, and the room seemed to notice that too. Celeste let out a quiet breath that might once have been a laugh, except nothing about the room felt amused now. No, she said. Maybe it is not. She looked at Damien one last time, then stepped away with the kind of grace that only made retreat look intentional. When she was gone, the silence she left behind did not soften. It deepened. Damien stood motionless for a moment, then turned to Zariah. You should not have had to answer for being in this room. Zariah's gaze drifted to the doorway, to the guests pretending not to stare, to the world that had just revealed its teeth beneath its manners. Maybe not, she said. But now I know exactly what kind of room it is. Damien looked at her then with something more dangerous than attraction. Respect. It unsettled him more than he would have admitted. Because Celeste had been wrong about one thing. He was not bored. He was beginning to understand that inviting Zariah Bennett into his world had done something he had not prepared for. It had forced him to choose, in front of everyone who mattered, whether he wanted their approval or the truth standing beside him. And when the room demanded he protect its rules, Damien Moretti had chosen her dignity instead. The rest of the evening moved as if nothing had happened, but everyone in Damien Moretti's townhouse understood that something had shifted, and in rooms built on unspoken rules, a shift was never small. Conversation resumed in careful waves, softer than before, each laugh measured, each glance carrying more meaning than words. Zariah Bennett felt it every time someone looked at her, and then quickly away. Every time a woman smiled too brightly. Every time a man suddenly discovered an urgent interest in his drink. The house had not become friendlier. It had simply become quieter in its judgment. Damien stayed beside her through dinner, not hovering, not performing, but present in a way that made every seat at the table adjust around that fact. He asked her opinion on the food before anyone else. He passed her the bread before serving himself. When one guest made a comment about neighborhood redevelopment in Brooklyn that sounded suspiciously like erasing the people who had lived there first, Damien did not answer. He looked at Zariah instead. She understood the invitation and the risk in it. It is interesting, she said calmly, setting down her water glass, how often progress seems to mean comfort for people who already have it and displacement for the people who made a place worth noticing. The man blinked. His wife stared into her plate. Across from them, Damien said only, "Go on." So she did. She spoke with the same measured certainty she had carried all night. Not loud, not theatrical, just clear. She talked about rising rents, about small businesses pushed out by polished branding, about families expected to call it opportunity when the neighborhood they built slowly stopped making room for them. No one interrupted. No one dared. And for the first time since she had entered the townhouse, Zariah understood that the room's real discomfort was not her dress, or her job, or even her presence at Damien's side. It was that she had entered their world without asking permission to shrink. By the time dessert arrived, the air had changed again. Not warm, not easy, but honest in a way the evening had not been before. A silver-haired investor who had dismissed her with his eyes earlier in the night now asked where she had gone to school. A woman from some charity board inquired, carefully, about her mother's rehabilitation work after Zariah mentioned healthcare costs in passing. The questions were still filtered through class and curiosity, but they were questions now, not assumptions. Damien noticed every one of them. He noticed, too, the cost of it on Zariah's face. She never lost her composure, but he saw the effort in the small pauses between answers, the way she straightened her shoulders before each new exchange, the way her hand remained wrapped around her water glass, as though the cool surface anchored her. Near midnight, guests began drifting toward the door under the glow of chandeliers and the soft murmur of polite farewells. The string quartet had long since stopped playing. Rain still traced the windows in faint silver lines. Celeste had left an hour earlier without another word. The room she left behind had never fully recovered its certainty. When the last car pulled away and the front doors finally closed, the townhouse seemed to exhale. Staff cleared glasses in near silence. Somewhere upstairs, a clock chimed once past 12. Zariah stood in the entry hall beneath the chandelier, her midnight blue dress catching the last of the warm light. and felt the strange hollowness that comes when a person has held herself together for so long she no longer knows where the tension ends. Damien approached from the drawing room, having seen off his final guest himself. Without the audience, he looked different, still controlled, still impossible to mistake for anyone else. But the performance required by powerful men in public had fallen away by a fraction, and in that fraction was something more honest than anything he had said all night. "The car is waiting," he said. Zariah nodded, then looked at him fully. "Why did you do it?" Damien was quiet for a moment. "Do what?" "Choose my side in front of all of them." The question was simple. The answer was not. He slipped one hand into his pocket, then took it back out again, an unusually restless motion for a man so practiced in stillness. "At first," he said, "because they were wrong." His gaze held hers, steady and unguarded in a way it had not been before. "And because I am tired of rooms that confuse cruelty for refinement." Zariah searched his face. At first, a faint shadow of a smile touched his mouth, though there was no ease in it. "At first," he repeated. "Then because I realized something I did not expect." The chandelier light caught in his blue eyes, softening them just enough to make the next words land harder. "You do not need saving. You do not need polishing. You do not need to become smaller or softer or more convenient for people like me to feel comfortable." He paused, and in that pause Zariah felt the whole evening gather itself into one final truth. "That is rare," Damien said quietly, "and it is not a challenge I was prepared for." The house went still around them, not with tension this time, but with recognition. Zariah had spent most of her life hearing versions of the same message from the world. Be pleasant. Be patient. Be useful. Be careful not to make powerful people uncomfortable with the full size of your dignity. And now here stood a man who had built his life on command and control, admitting that what unsettled him was not her defiance, but her integrity. She looked away first, not from fear, but because the moment felt too intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with truth. "You invited me here to test whether I could survive your world," she said softly. Damien's answer came low and immediate. "No," she looked back at him. "No. I invited you because I was curious," he said. "I kept you beside me because I was impressed." Then, after the smallest pause, and somewhere in between, I realized I was the one being tested. Zariah let that sit between them. Outside, a car door shut on the street below. One of the house staff passed soundlessly through the far hallway and disappeared again. The city moved on, indifferent and glittering and awake. "And did you pass?" she asked. For the first time since she had known him, Damien looked like a man answering without the protection of certainty. "I do not know yet." The honesty of it caught her off guard more than any compliment could have. She drew in a slow breath. "Good." One dark brow lifted. "Good." Zariah stepped closer, not enough to make the air between them intimate, just enough to make it clear she was speaking as an equal. "Because I am not interested in men who think one decent decision makes them extraordinary." The faintest smile returned, deeper this time, touched with something like respect, and something more dangerous beginning beneath it. "No," he said. "I gathered that." She reached for the shawl lying over the arm of a nearby chair and draped it over her shoulders. "Then gather this too. I came tonight because I wanted to see whether your world was as impressive as it thinks it is." Damien watched her with a focus that felt almost reverent. "And?" Zariah looked toward the rain-streaked windows, then back at him. "It is expensive," she said, "but I am still deciding whether it is worth much." The room went quiet again, but this time the silence belonged to them. Damien Moretti, who had spent years surrounded by people eager to please him, felt something unfamiliar settle under his ribs, not possession, not victory, but the sharp, humbling awareness that there were some women no amount of wealth could impress and no amount of power could command. As he walked her to the door, he understood at last that the real challenge had never been getting Zariah Bennett into his world. It would be becoming the kind of man she might one day choose not to walk away from.